Joe. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Nice to be back at UXDX. I ran a fireside last year. Today I'm with Daniela. This should be a great talk. We're going to talk about a few themes. I'm going to kick off where we're going to talk a little bit about collaboration and kind of working and how to build effective teams. We're then going to sort of tap into Daniela's journey, career journey, what it is to be a design leader, and then we'll finish off talking a little bit about strategy and creating a vision in a company of 50,000 people. How do you make that work? So to kick off, Daniela, let's start with collaboration. And so working with multidisciplinary teams. Talk through how you think about that in terms of making those teams effective.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here talking about, I think, one of my favorite topics. What I always like to say is we all get into design, right? And we go to design school, and the focus is really around like designing for people. And then when you get into your first job, you're like, oh, no one prepared me for how to design with people, right? And that's a whole other set of challenges that all of a sudden you have to learn how to navigate and how to align folks, et cetera. So that's really, for me, how I reframe like all of my design training. And I think about like, okay, if you have a group of people who ideally are aligned around a common goal, but who are bringing a bunch of other things to the table and to the mix, like how do you make that work? I like to equate it to, for instance, if you're going to dinner, if anyone has ever experienced trying to make a decision about where to go to dinner or what to get for dinner with other people, like all of you want to get fed, but one person is on a diet, the other person has some restrictions, someone else is feeling like Mexican, Italian, whatever it might be. So to me, it was really about applying that same curiosity that we learn when designing for people to the people that you're designing with, and trying to really understand like what's keeping them up at night. Yeah. What are their motivators? What are they trying to accomplish? What pressures might they be under? To really make sure that we're putting all of that out there and really finding that sort of common language and common way of working, being curious about the business so that I'm not coming in and like speaking design when everyone else is speaking business. But it's really about like really being mindful of the fact that you're now trying to get design work done with a bunch of people.
Yeah, give me an example. Like you've obviously had some fantastic experience where you've really delivered the best customer experience. And what was that? What was the magic behind getting that one team working together?
I'll give a couple of examples. I'll give some more sort of generic answers and then maybe some specific examples. I think on the more generic piece of it, which is where that's happened the best, was where we could get teams to align on the problem that we were solving and on the success criteria before we ever started designing. I find that that's really critical because it's much easier for people to align on like what success looks like, right? And it's then a little bit harder where opinions come in is, well, I don't like this, I like that, I don't like this part of the design. So that's more of like a key, I think, practice that I feel works really well. The specific example that I'll then give that's representative of that was at a prior company. We were redesigning our app, and we knew that it needed to be redesigned for a number of reasons. It was, the IA was broken, the app wasn't scaling because we had added so many things to it. We knew that it was really hard for customers to use it. But we also knew that the business had this goal of wanting to just introduce customers to more features, to more products. So that was a great way of actually aligning again against a business goal that the business had, and actually say, hey, if we have this goal of having people discover, more of our product and features, like that will be the success criteria. And the only way we can achieve that is actually if we redesign the app. And because that was the goal, we could make all of the design recommendations and a lot of the design decisions, and it was easy to measure whether or not we were, accomplishing the goal that we had set up to do, and no one was then changing course midway and saying, no, now we've moved the goalpost and it's this other goal that we have. So I think it's always about, again, really being clear on the problem that you're solving and on like how you'll measure whether or not you're going in the right direction.
Yeah. That's super clear. There's been talks earlier where they talk about design having a seat at the table and what that means and how important that is. What's your perspective of that kind of statement?
I have a lot of feelings and thoughts on this, as I'm sure you all do, but more in the sense that I feel like sometimes as an industry, as a community, we get too obsessed with design having a seat at the table, like the collective. And when I reflect back on when I know that like team members are being included or when I'm invited to a discussion, it's all because of what that person is bringing to the discussion. It's not because they're saying, we need design in the room. Who from design should be in the room? No, it's because they will say, I want John or I want Daniela's opinions and contributions on this. So I feel like that's really important. I feel like if we're always trying to say we want people to think of us as design first, individual second, that's a much harder hill to climb.
Yeah.
And it's much easier for you to think about like, what are you contributing?
Yeah.
And if individually all of us are showing up in a way that's very influential, that's again informed, through business acumen, where we're able to speak much more broadly than just the role that we play in design, you'll get invited over and over again. And then that's how design gets a seat at the table. But, trying to do like the collective and having like our roles recognized, I think it's a much tougher thing to. I mean, you're a business leader. Do you think about that? Like,
no, the same. No, it's really important. I think with the best team dynamics over the years that I've had, it's always been a multidisciplinary group, multicultural group, different perspectives, and you want different perspectives in the room. That's where generally you get the best output. And I really like the fact that, it's your own attributes, it's who, your energy, it's your skill set, it's your experience that you're bringing to a team. So, hey, a younger you, how do you get into an exec leadership position? Like, what would you recommend someone that, say, earlier on in their design career or thinking about making that step to a kind of leadership or even like a line management role? What would be some advice you would give?
So let me start with how I got into, like, how I picked management over, staying the individual contributor path. It happened very early for me, and for a couple of reasons. One is, in my first job, I was working with some very talented designers, and I saw that they had, like, amazing ideas. They came up with designs that were way better than what I was coming up with to be, perfect. I was a good designer. They were amazing. But sometimes their ideas wouldn't go very far. They didn't know how to communicate. They didn't know how to, again, drive to that alignment, pitch it to folks who were in decision, making roles at the time. So I got really motivated to figure out, like, how can I actually help other designers be more effective in being heard, in being influential. So creating an environment for them to do, to apply their amazing skills was what motivated me. And it became a really easy decision to choose management over continuing down the individual contributor path. And then I think just continuing to do that, both in helping like other designers be effective in complex organizations. And then just my curiosity, like I've always been really curious about how businesses work and every facet of each business and had opinions on all of those things. So then I would get invited to discussions that went well beyond what I was doing from a design perspective, I think is what helped me then get into bigger and bigger leadership roles. So it was, yes, because I knew how to make design work, but also yes, because I showed up as a business leader.
Nice. And so talk about your journey. Like everyone's got their own career journey of how they fall into roles. And on your career journey, what things did you learn along the way that have actually contributed to your leadership style?
So the first thing, and when Alex and I were preparing for this, one of the things that I mentioned to him is I ended up becoming an expert in working in complex organizations, not necessarily by choice, but when I started off, I was an international student here in the U.S., and then needed companies to sponsor my visa. And back then, there weren't that many. Like, this wasn't as common as it is today. So only larger companies were willing to actually make that investment and go through that process, and had legal teams or legal companies that would do that for them. So that was my first job. And then when you would get your visa transferred, you needed sort of like that same, companies that were willing to do that. And as a designer and as someone who likes to observe humans and how systems work, et cetera, there's something about complex organizations that to me was very intriguing, again, and figure out like how are these groups of people coming together and getting things done? How are decisions being made? So I sort of stuck with it. So that has been like my professional journey. And I think through observing again, like how humans come together and how things happen and why companies make the decisions that they make, it's really helped me, I think, again, shape in a way that goes beyond just design leadership and more just having, I think, being able to have opinions and a view and an understanding of how all aspects of the company work.
And now as a leader, what would you say are your kind of key kind of strengths of how you manage your team and manage up, and like what kind of leader are you now shaped to be?
So building relationships, I feel like is probably how I lead, and again, maybe that came with
that helped, right?
That
Probably
helped
in your early
tremendously,
start.
and like again, being an immigrant, it's one of those things that you have to almost like invest more in. So I feel like I picked up those skills, and always applied that to work. Once you get to know people as people, it's so much easier to, first of all, like not take things personally, be able to have the conversations that you need to have, be able to send someone a text message or a Slack and be like, hey, I heard this or I saw this. Just last week, I had to reach out to a colleague and be like, hey, back to the seat at the table. I know you're having this really important meeting. I heard our team isn't included, like how can we get design in there, et cetera. So if I didn't have that relationship, it would be much harder for me to send someone a message out of the blue saying like, hey, how can I get my team in that meeting, in that discussion? So I always lead with getting to know people and building those relationships first and foremost. I think the other thing is just saying the thing. And I don't think you need to say it in a way that's aggressive or that hurts those relationships, quite the contrary. So I think, calling out the thing that's sometimes there's like that elephant in the room that no one else is calling out. I think putting it out there, but then helping to facilitate, again, drawing on our design facilitation skills to get teams realigned, or to get teams to talk about the thing that isn't being said that's getting in the way, are all things that I feel like I bring to the table, and as does, I think, anyone in design or product or technology that's, again, having to work cross-functionally.
Do you think design's also influenced the way that you storytell? And the way that you I've always sort of felt that that's a sort of expression, if you think about, simplicity and clarity of message, that's probably something that you need to be doing.
Absolutely.
Daily,
I wouldn't
right?
say that I'm a great storyteller, but I always think about the audience first, right? And that, again, comes from my design training. I'm always think about, like, if we say this, what will the audience think? Is that the right thing to say to this particular audience or to this audience or to an executive?
Yeah.
So always thinking audience first. And I know as a CEO, we were talking about how for you, that's also...
Yeah, it's different. Like I think obviously for you, because you started in a large organization, you've almost, off the bat, you've had to work in a matrix. You had to work out and navigate how you work with people, right? And how you kind of influence people and how you storytell. Yeah, I think for me personally, I'm now in my third CEO journey, but I started in broadcast television. And actually thinking back, there were two skills that I learned in broadcast television, which I still use to this day. One was I worked on a news show and it had a deadline of 5 p.m. on a Friday. We had to finish the show. And for me, that really helped with my project management and organizational skills, because I just knew I had to deliver. Like we couldn't, like if we didn't deliver, there was no show. The other thing was storytelling. And I learned a lot. I was quite a creative kind of producer at the time. And all I do is storytell now, because I'm storytelling visions to my team. I'm communicating a strategy, but also for my investors and the exec suite. It's about clarity of message, and a lot of that is storytelling and relationship building. And I still, it's interesting with all the sort of mentions of technology and other bits and pieces. I think business is all about people. It's all about relationships and how you navigate those. And those sort of base skills that people have are as important in whatever role that you're in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, it's so core to what we do as designers, right? It's just that we're much more focused on like how we're storytelling or taking users along on a journey. And it's, again, no different, I think, in how it is in terms of like the dynamics of people you work with.
Yeah. So think about strategic planning and like creating a vision. How do you start that motion in an organization like that you're in? Like, how do you start that process and initiate those sort of new ideas, new initiatives?
So Capital One specifically has a way of approaching strategy that I really appreciate, and it's a very cross-functional effort, which is awesome. But what I really like is that we always start by looking at the outside. So again, this will sound, I think, very familiar to everyone in the audience, but we look at like what's happening in the world. Right? What are folks that are great at this thing doing? So what are those beacon companies doing? What's happening from a technology standpoint? And then work backwards to like, where's the point of highest leverage for us? And then we do the sort of like, so what and what ifs of problem solving, if you will, or of diverging in terms of everything that it could be, and then coming back with a recommendation on what the strategy needs to be. So I really appreciate that approach to strategy. And then from a more specific sort of design perspective, I'm also a big fan of like working backwards from that compelling story or that compelling destination, and that's something that we also do quite often, where be it whatever method or delivery mechanism that you might choose. It could be a prototype, it could be the press release, it could be whatever it is, but like working backwards and then figuring out how you deliver against that like exciting destination is something that we utilize quite often.
Yeah. So that gives a nice sort of structure, almost centers the team back to what problem you're trying to solve,
that's exactly
or what focus. Right. And then how do you then, so you create this new vision, how do you cascade that message? And what does that look like when there's 50,000 employees and it might be something, big for the organization? What's that process look like?
I would say it probably varies depending, on what the strategy is. But I think what's the more important piece of it is that everyone is clear on what the message is, and then it's like for everyone's role, I think, in carrying that message and sort of activating or connecting back to that strategy. So of course, yes, it gets cascaded to everyone in the company, but then it's like how you link back to it. So for instance, in design, we might say, hey, at the company strategy level, you heard this thing, and here's how what we're doing ladders up to what you heard in that session, and providing that line of sight back to that strategy. But it really varies. I think back to again a prior experience at another company where the president of that company really liked to do like a big media event with whatever the strategy was for the year. And in that case, we had like videos and prototypes, and it was much more like what you might see in a demo, right?
Yeah.
When companies
big
are rolling,
up,
exactly.
big show.
Yeah. So I found that it really varies depending on the context and just company dynamics and company culture.
Yeah, and some of those messages might be one big message, or it might be multiple messages that
Correct.
You're repeating.
Yes.
And then how does it make it happen? Like how do you then sort of track how that works with you and then the team? So you've created this vision, and maybe there's a pathway of updating a product of some sort, and you've got a 6-month horizon. Are you weekly check-ins, monthly check-ins? How does that operate for you?
It's a good question. Again, it will vary per, I think, initiative that you might be, working on. I personally, as a leader and my team, we like to be personally involved in a couple of key priorities, and what we'll do is just make sure that we have coverage across. So on some of the projects that I'm in, we're meeting every 2 weeks to see how things are going. And again, back to that point earlier around the goals that we set out, right? Are we still aligned on those goals? Do we still feel like what we're building is going to deliver on the goals? What's the learning agenda to make sure that the decisions that we're making along the way are really, again, connecting back to the success criteria that we defined early on? But that's usually what it is. Like the cadences and the rhythms may vary, but I think what's more important is that sort of like discipline and rigor of having the success metrics and having a learning agenda. So, because it's really easy, I'm sure you've all experienced, where all of a sudden there's roadblocks, constraints, etc. A team falls in love with an idea and you take a complete right turn and you don't realize that you've taken that turn. So I think what's really important is, again, just always reminding yourselves it's valid to take a right turn, but it needs to be intentional because you maybe got new data. But I think that discipline of connecting back to what you were attempting to do and why is what really matters.
So is that almost the practical tip if you do receive roadblocks?
Yeah.
It's almost to center back to where you started and make a decision point whether you want to pivot or not.
1,000%. And I think being that person to actually say, hey, did something change, right?
Yeah.
When we set out, like this is what we said, we were solving for, did something change and now we're solving for a different thing?
Yeah.
Or are we actually like veering off course? I think asking those questions is a really good way of getting that clarity and making sure that, like, again, maybe design wasn't in the room and, a decision was made, but I think asking clarifying questions is really important.
Yeah, it's quite a simple concept really, but in terms of that alignment before you get going.
Yeah.
It is super, super important.
Agreed.
Cool. All right. Joe, shall I ask some questions? Are we time to move? Okay. So we have a few questions that are going to come up. I've got one here, so we'll jump on to the first one. What recommendations would you give to others on growing into leadership roles while staying true to themselves?
I love that question because I feel like we all have an image in our head of what you must be like to be a leader. And the reality is leaders come in all shapes and sizes, right? I'm a complete introvert. I'm shy. I'm not the person who likes to have the spotlight on me. I'm not someone who, is like this big rah-rah personality, but none of that, I think, gets in the way of me being an effective leader. So I actually feel like, if anything, you just need to know who you are at the core. You don't have to compromise on who you are. And if anything, I think being authentic to who you are is what's going to make you most effective as a leader. People pick up when you're not being authentic, when you're like playing a character. So I feel like just lean into the things that make you you, lean into your strengths, and then where you might we all have strengths and we all have gaps. You can always complement that with those folks that are around you. And I know we were talking a little bit about this before coming in here. So, I mean, you're a CEO. Do you feel, how have you stayed true to yourself in this journey?
Yeah, I think much the same. I think when I first took on the CEO role, I was there for 11 years. The final 6, I was CEO, and I sort of earned the right to be the CEO. And it was a CEO traineeship, so I wasn't really getting much support or much advice. And I went on my gut feel, and my gut feel was very much around culture, aligning teams to a vision, and I feel like I've kept true to that actually throughout. And I think you're super right. Like when you look at roles, and there's designers and there's engineers and there's product managers and the like. I think you get a bit caught up sometimes in the discipline of it, and you do lose the opportunity of your own authenticity.
Yes.
Which might be that you've moved a number of countries and have a different background. It might be that you switched roles at a certain point, or you might just have a knack of presenting, or a knack of managing a workshop, or whatever it might be. All those sort of skills and attributes are important, and probably worth kind of having a sense of yourself of what they are. All right, here we go. After working in small startups the past decade, what would help prepare for a transition to a larger organization? That's a good question.
That's a really good question. And as someone who hasn't had the experience of
working
right?
in
small startups,
different experience.
It is a different experience. I think, I feel like some of the principles will probably be the same that we already covered, right? Again, like relationships will still matter. Knowing the business will still matter. I think one thing that ideally bring with you is, I feel like when you're in a startup, and those that I've advised in the past, you do get to have much more of a say, or at least exposure to all aspects of the business when you're in a startup than you might by default in a complex organization. It's very easy in a large organization to sort of pigeonhole yourself, again, to just staying in your lane and not being curious about like what the risk organization is doing, or what's happening in legal, or what's happening in the large HR department. So I think the fact that you actually in a small startup have that visibility across, bring that with you. Yeah. I actually think that will really help you as you get into a large organization, so that you really understand like the larger organization at scale and all of the different groups and what they all do and how you can work with all of them and and leverage those relationships.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I've worked both sides, and again, it's I think coming from large into small, you can take some of that structure.
Yeah.
That structural thing is good around even setting kind of alignment and goals would be an important thing that you can absolutely take to a startup, so it's not chaotic and all over the place. There's almost a calming thing. And then likewise, if you switch it, if you can bring a little bit more of that entrepreneurial spirit, some of those generalist skills that you set up, that can actually help you, right, in a dynamic with your teams and building relationships and the like. Okay, next question. Reflecting on your journey to leadership in tech, what was the most significant barrier you faced as a woman in tech? Do you believe that challenge still persists for women entering the industry today?
This is always a tough question in the sense that, I think all of the things that make you unique can be barriers. I also feel like they can be things that you lean into, right, as a way to connect with others. So for sure, I'm sure that I was left out of certain conversations or outings because of my gender. We all know that happens. But if anything, I really leaned into the fact that I was a woman and bringing a different perspective into conversations. I leaned into the fact that I was an immigrant and had a different lived experience than others. I always leaned into the fact that I was a designer. And so I know this is going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but if anything, I would highlight the fact that I had a very different perspective than everyone else in the room and bring in a very different opinion, or call out the fact that we were overlooking something. And I actually feel like people appreciated that. They appreciated the fact that I was raising a point that no one else was seeing in the room. And I do believe that that's why I would then again get invited back into the room and getting that seat at the table. So even though I feel like I recognized that, yes, some of those things got in the way, I also leaned into it. And I think just felt like it was a differentiator that others should appreciate versus, resent.
Well, it's almost like there's a concept like a one team, and actually, I'd say you're a big team player, right? And,
I am.
And you're coming in, and you can understand how to collaborate and play in that dynamic. And I think being a good team player does people want to work with you. You're not in a silo, and you're not kind of doing your own thing. You're working with people, you're curious with people, and you're collaborating with people. And no one thing can be possible. It needs a whole group of individuals to make, deliver the business results. Ultimately, is a team game.
Yeah, and I feel like you can be a team player and also an individual, right? And again, have those individual experiences and
with your
individual
authenticity
point of views.
of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. What was the biggest challenge you have today in your role? Maybe one that you didn't expect stepping into your current roles.
Probably the biggest challenge is figuring out where to spend my time. I talked earlier about the fact that, I always try to pick a couple of things that, like at any given time, I'm personally involved in because they're strategically important for the company, where maybe design is a real point of leverage for that particular initiative. And that's always the hardest thing, especially when you have a large team that works across many, many areas. It always means that you're going to be ignoring parts of parts of what your team is working on in order to do that. But I'm also really big on focus. I feel like for you to actually have an impact and make a difference, you have to be focused. But that's always the challenging part. It's like picking, it feels like you're picking your favorite child.
Do you have some tricks? Do you have tricks of how you prioritize? Like how do you go about that?
It's usually what I mentioned, right? Either something that's like hugely strategically important for the company, and something that where also design or my sort of customer experience perspective will have a meaningful impact. And then I think the other important piece to it is just being very explicit about the fact that I'm doing that, so my team knows that that's what I'm doing, and that it doesn't mean that their thing is not important, and that it doesn't mean that like the area that they work in might be the thing that I'll be focusing on 3 months from now, right? It's like it's not a static decision, but I think just being very explicit about what I'm focusing, and to the point that I made earlier, making sure that each of us on the team are then also like leaning into a couple of things, and that's how we then get that sort of broad coverage and attention.
That's almost, I mean, that's just a great skill set to have to keep things moving, right?
Yes.
Because if you couldn't do that, or if you didn't do that, you'd just be drowning in information and bits and pieces, because there is a never-ending list of things that we could be doing.
Right. And you minimize your impact, I feel like, if you're spread across too many things all at once.
And so someone say in a more junior role, how do they manage that? They're being sort of told what to do in their group. Like, is there a dynamic? Is it, again, being a team player and being transparent about what you're doing? Can you operate the same way looking up?
I think you can, even when you're more junior, right? I feel like you can have a point of view on where you feel like you need to prioritize, and then I think check with others to make sure that like there's alignment in terms of what you're prioritizing. The other thing, which is a slightly different take on this question, but one of the best designers I ever had working for me would come to our one-on-ones, and whenever I would ask her to do something else, she would pull out her list of priorities and say, if this is the most important thing, do you agree that these two things should drop? And as a new manager, it was, like, wow, I love that that's a really tough question, but I love that she's doing that to me. And she trained me, right, to be much better in actually helping my team prioritize, and I really applauded her for doing that.
Yeah, in some ways that might be a tough question. There might even be a tough conversation because it's not what you want to hear.
Right.
But again, going back to alignment and focus, though, that conversation is important, because then when you have that clarity, you can move forward and progress in whatever you're.
That's exactly right.
Whatever you're focused on. All right, I think we got room for another quick question. How do you balance competing priorities in a financial industry, like optimizing UX while mitigating fraud? I mean, I guess you're in a banking industry, highly regulated. How does that work for you in terms of decisions?
Again, it's definitely a team sport, right? It's not something that we decide alone. But I think it goes back to where we started on, which is just being really clear on the metrics that you're solving for.
Managing the risks in the right way.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I feel like you will always need, and while things may appear equal, there is always like a tiebreaker, right, in those decisions that you may have to choose one over the other. But also I think that's where creativity really comes in, right? I actually feel like sometimes the most constrained or the most limited the situation, the more creative. Yeah,
it's actually, because it's a good conversation to have, because I think being really clear on your risks and you're having conversations around how you might mitigate those or approaches, etc. You do get, you become better problem solvers. Everything's up front. And you're much more aware of things.
And bringing, I think, those folks into the discussion too. I think that some of my most favorite projects and I think most innovative moments have been where you actually have folks like fraud, risk, legal in the room brainstorming on solutions, right? Instead of having it be more of like they're just coming in with the constraints. Like, no, invite them into the room.
Back to your subject matter experts being in the room and working together.
And they don't want to just be walking around with a stick, right? Like they also want to be problem solvers. So like invite them into the room and you'll come up with much better outcomes.
Cool. Thanks so much, Daniela. That was great.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.